Okay, so we make that about 11:30, so we'll get started. So welcome everyone to our webinar on how to excel in meeting supplier sustainability expectations. This webinar is part of Net Zero Week 2024, which is the UK's official National Awareness Week. And you can learn more about the week and still get free tickets for many more online events at www.netzeroweek.com. So just to introduce your webinar host today, so there's myself, Susie Jackson. I'm lead consultant in sustainability and ESG at Beyondly, and I am joined by my colleague Liz Wood, who is our sustainability manager and principal consultant. So in terms of what we're going to talk through today, we're going to discuss drivers of sustainability expectations, the rise of sustainability questionnaires, go through a few various actions that you can take, so broken down into fundamentals, accelerators, those leading actions, give you some top tips, and also discuss how we can help. So for those of you that don't know, Beyondly is an environmental compliance and consultancy scheme. We are B Corp accredited, and we really like to share our knowledge with businesses to help them become more confident about their environmental choices, from compliance obligations, contributing to a circular economy, and going beyond net zero. We offer a range of different services, so from environmental compliance, including packaging, waste electricals and batteries, producer responsibility compliance, consultancy as well, so both the ESOS and SECR regulations, as well as those more voluntary services such as ESG, carbon management and circular economy, and we also do waste collections as well.
Okay. Thank you, Susanna. So my name's Liz, nice to meet you all. So I'm going to talk through some of the drivers of sustainability expectations. So as the graph shows, this is the changes in emissions over time that are predicted by different climate pathways. So we had the Paris Agreement in 2015, and here nations committed to long-term targets to limit global warming. And the UK also committed to its own net zero target in 2019. And since these commitments, we've seen environmental and social challenges be on the rise in terms of the corporate agenda. However, as you can see on this graph, current global policies are still not on track for what is required to limit global warming below that 1.5 degree threshold above pre-industrial levels. So if global temperatures do rise above 1.5 degrees above that pre-industrial baseline, that would have a devastating impact on the planet. And this has been well detailed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. And this has impacts ranging from near complete destruction of all coral reefs to 1 in 7 plant species losing half of their habitat. So the consequences of this warming world are already being witnessed globally and are contributing to uncertainty. So with the global policies that we currently have in place, we're on track to reach approximately 2.9 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And if global governments deliver on their promises in terms of pledges and targets, we may limit that to 2.1 degrees of warming. But that is still above the 1.5 degree threshold that we need to be aiming for. Okay, so internationally, governments, businesses have begun to understand the enormity of climate change and the need to tackle it. So the timeline on this slide shows some of the key milestones in terms of international agreements on climate action and UK legislation to reduce emissions at a national scale, and also the legislation which applies to UK companies. So this slide covers a 26-year period. And by contrast, this slide covers only 5 years. So what's really important here in the take-home message is the pace of change has quickened really rapidly over the last 10 years. So in the UK, we've seen the introduction of the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme and streamlined energy and carbon reporting, which have brought in a lot more mandatory requirements for larger businesses in the UK. So as I've already mentioned, as a nation, the UK legislated in June 2019 to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and we became the first major economy to do so. So this means by 2050 that as a nation we'll have dramatically reduced our emissions and commit to offsetting any avoidable emissions by funding long-term carbon capture through tree planting projects, for example. So companies obviously have a critical role to play in the decarbonisation of industry, infrastructure, value chains, and the things that we produce and consume. Another side to the coin with this is that millennials and Gen Z have been engaged with these issues throughout their childhood at school, and many will now expect employers to share their values when choosing who to buy from and where to work. So it's really important differentiator in terms of getting employees in increasingly complicated and challenging marketplace for employees. So you can see some stats on the screen from a PwC survey. So this was back in 2019, so it's probably advanced even further. But a large proportion of people said that they would pay more for sustainably produced items and would avoid the use of plastic. The same PwC study also showed that 86% of employees prefer to support or work for companies that care about the same issues that they do. And as a B Corp, anecdotally, we found that we can employ a lot higher grade of people who are interested in our values and working for this kind of a business.
So thanks, Liz. Hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview of where the drivers are coming from behind all these sort of sustainability pressures that you might be feeling as a business. Businesses are really changing with the changing world. The climate crisis has led to the establishment of various initiatives to assess and improve companies' environmental performance. You're probably feeling pressure from investors, government, customers, employees, and even the general public. And the impact on climate change on sort of global supply chains is really beginning to bite, and we're seeing material shortages, increased crop failures, even geopolitical unrest. So you're probably likely as a business to have experienced this increasing demand from your customers and really starting to be asked to meet certain requirements or participate in initiatives in order to continue working with them. So just to start with one quite common one is the Carbon Disclosure Project. This was one of the first of these sort of sustainability initiatives that were released back in 2008. And it's a platform for companies to disclose their environmental impacts. And investors often use CDP data to assess a company's environmental performance as well. You can see the increase in the number of supply chain disclosures that have happened via the CDP since it started back in 2008. And over 24,000 organisations around the world disclosed data through the CDP in 2023, so a real increase. Just wanted to show this carbon tunnel vision diagram on the screen. So this really depicts the concept of carbon tunnel vision, in which organisations can become overly fixated on just the carbon emissions metric, which, while this is undeniably crucial, it's only one aspect of environmental sustainability and the road to net zero. Initially, as part of the CDP, many companies were only disclosing this emissions information, but as you can see on the graph on the right, the number disclosing information on water and forests has really increased over recent years. And that's driven by a growing global awareness of the impacts of deforestation and water scarcity and the risks that they pose to businesses, as well as an expansion of the CDP framework to include and improve those disclosures. From 2024, so from this year, very recently, the CDP have actually merged the forest and water questions into the main disclosure questionnaire to increase pressures on all businesses to report on those aspects going forwards. So when it comes to net zero target setting, the Science Based Targets Initiative is one of the most widely recognised and credible initiatives. They exist to define and promote best practice in emissions reductions and net zero targets in line with the climate science. They also provide technical assistance and expert resources to companies who are setting science-based targets, and they provide that independent assessment and validation side of target setting as well. So targets are considered science-based if they are in line with what the latest climate science deems is necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement that we mentioned earlier, so limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And the Science Based Targets Initiative actually released their own net zero standard back in 2021. And their definition of net zero is reducing emissions in line with science-based targets by at least 90 to 95% by 2050 or sooner, and then using that long-term carbon capture and storage offset projects for any remaining emissions. And again, we've seen a real exponential growth in the number of businesses committing to and setting science-based targets since it started back in 2015. So companies need to be working with their suppliers to reduce their emissions, and some are even asking them to set their own science-based targets and supporting them with that. So the impact of setting science-based targets are really being felt throughout the supply chain as well. Not only are businesses increasing their requirements, it's also being seen from the government as well. So PPN 0621 was an initiative introduced back in 2021, and that requires suppliers bidding for major government contracts to commit to achieving net zero and publish a carbon reduction plan, including scope 1 and 2 emissions and 5 categories of scope 3 emissions. And then going even further than that, the NHS has quite stringent requirements for their suppliers. So from April 2027, they're asking suppliers to publish a carbon reduction plan for all scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, not just those 5 categories that the government are currently asking for. And suppliers are being asked to complete questionnaires via the Evergreen Sustainable Supplier Assessment, which is the NHS's online self-assessment and reporting tool, so that suppliers can share their sustainability information with the NHS. So beyond just carbon and the environment, businesses are under increasing pressure to act responsibly across all the areas of environment, social and governance. EcoVadis is another quite significant one in the area, and that's a sustainability ratings platform which many large corporations require their suppliers to have. So it goes beyond carbon and includes social and governance criteria as well. And there's been a 134% increase in EcoVadis assessments completed since 2018, purely as awareness surrounding supply chain due diligence grows and more organisations are beginning to assess and monitor their suppliers. And over the past 15 years, EcoVadis has rated over 90,000 companies. So just the last one we wanted to touch on is B corporations. And although B corporation certification is not often a requirement asked for of suppliers, the awareness and the number of certified businesses has rapidly increased in recent years. It's also one of the most comprehensive sustainability assessments that there is, so it can actually be extremely useful as a tool for companies to benchmark themselves across that range of ESG issues. And many of the questions that are asked as part of the other assessments that I've just mentioned will also be covered in the B Impact Assessment. So being a B Corp really makes responding to a lot of those other ratings platforms much more straightforward. So what the B Impact Assessment does is it assesses companies across 5 areas of governance, workers, community, environment and customers. And the assessment is tailored according to the business size and industry. And then there's various evaluation and verification stages that are involved. And once certified, companies need to recertify every 3 years. And the other thing about B Corps is they're legally required to consider the impact of their decisions on all stakeholders, not just the shareholders. The intention being to avoid decisions being made exclusively with the view of maximising profit. So again, we've seen a real increase in the number of B Corps. So globally, it's more than doubled in 3 years, going from about 3,700 in 2020 to nearly 8,000 at the end of 2023. So a really significant increase there too.
Thank you, Susanna. So in order to excel in these various supplier questionnaires, there's a number of actions that you can take. So we're going to start off with the fundamentals. So I guess you can think of these as the foundation steps. So one fundamental and starting point for all businesses is calculating an organisational carbon footprint. This is essential for any business as a first step to achieving net zero, given that you can't manage what you don't measure. So a carbon footprint is a measure of the emissions produced as a result of an organisation's operations. It's normally calculated based on carbon emitted over a period of time, and that's usually 1 year. So that could be a calendar year, or increasingly businesses will calculate this in line with their financial year. It involves calculating the total emissions released to the atmosphere, either directly, which is from emissions from sources that you own or control, for example, from a gas boiler located at the company site, or indirectly, which is greenhouse gas emissions that are a consequence of your operations or activity, but arise outside of sites or assets that you own. So these indirect emissions might occur upstream or downstream in that value chain. So this might be, for example, electricity generated by burning fossil fuels at a power station, or supplier emissions associated with products that you might buy. So we would suggest, as a fundamental, businesses calculate their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So given these are likely to be areas that they have the most control and influence over, and the majority of supplier questionnaires will ask about your company's scope 1 and 2 emissions. So for those of you who might not be familiar with emissions scope, we talk about scope 1, which is your direct emissions, which is the green arrow on the diagram on screen. So these are emissions from activities you own or control. So this is where the emissions come directly out of an owned or controlled asset. So that might be emissions from a boiler, a vehicle, or a furnace. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions associated with energy. So within the UK, for most businesses, this is associated with the consumption of purchased electricity, but it can include district heat, steam, and cooling. So these are emissions that are a consequence of your activity, but they occur somewhere that you don't own or control. So that's the power station example I mentioned on the previous slide. And then the two light blue curves on either side are your scope 3 emissions. So there's 15 categories of scope 3, and these are emissions, again, which don't occur at your site or assets you control, but they're very much associated with the activities that your business might carry out. So the examples of these might be business travel, waste disposal, or purchase materials and services. Okay, so thinking about how you're using energy is another fundamental, and the measurement of energy use is often essential to calculating carbon footprint and will often be asked for in supplier questionnaires. So the best thing is to think about how and when you're using gas, electricity. And some of these can be really simple, but can have a really big impact and lead to energy savings and cost reductions. So if you aren't already doing so, it's worth starting to measure the energy that you're using. So you can measure energy consumption using regular meter readings or by recording consumption figures from invoices. You can also install smart meters to help identify where you can reduce energy. You should also assess when you're heating your premises. So quite often on energy audits, this is something that we identify, that heating isn't necessarily in line with demand. So look at simple things like when the heating's coming off and going off, and whether the temperature is appropriate for outside temperatures. Also switching things off when they're not in use, and ensuring appliances that have eco or energy saving modes have those activated. So when it comes to lighting, LEDs are rated as the most effective and efficient lighting technology, and they also have a much longer life, lower maintenance costs, and can represent cost savings of up to 80% for a business. You can also build in sensors if you're looking to do a rewiring project that would be on occupancy and light levels. Also, it's never glamorous, but actually makes a big difference, is insulation. So insulating lofts, pipes, replacing UPV seals and handles on windows, for example, to exclude drafts can actually make a really big difference. So also, according to the Carbon Trust, you can achieve up to 10% of energy savings through addressing staff behaviours. So consider reigniting or conducting energy saving campaigns, staff energy training on best practice, identifying energy champions, displaying the usual posters, leaflets, and really getting it built into the way of doing business, both within office environments, but also within fleet and drivers as well. So we're moving on to fleet now. So you can conduct analysis on your company fleet data to identify wasteful practices. So you may have telematics installed, which will allow you to identify things like idling, heavy braking, or acceleration. And you can again carry out training to try and avoid these behaviours. Also looking at route optimisation and reducing the distance travelled overall. And then finally, to encompass all of the above, you could request a full on-site energy audit of your premises where they'd look at every aspect of your energy use and give you some costed energy saving recommendations so you'd understand the possibilities and savings that you could make. So sustainability assessments and ESG covers a really wide range of factors, as Susanna's already mentioned, with tunnel vision, and it can be quite difficult for companies to cover all of them in depth. So something that we would recommend is a materiality assessment. So this is a process used to determine which ESG issues are the most important to the long-term success of the business and its stakeholders. And going beyond a simple materiality assessment, you can look at something called double materiality, which is the concept that encourages a company to judge materiality from two perspectives. So that's both in terms of whether external factors trigger financial impacts on the company. So that might be, for example, reducing or increasing demand for a product or service with climate change. And then secondly, examining how the business actually triggers impacts on the external environment, and so the impacts that your business might have on the wider environment. Factors relevant to the business can be assessed and plotted on a graph similar to that by Unilever, which is shown on the screen. And essentially this looks at the different factors, ranking them against the company's internal values versus those of stakeholders like investors, suppliers and customers. And this can really help to create a clear picture of how company values align with stakeholders and help to engage with them. It's a good idea if you are going to do any ESG initiatives or develop an ESG strategy to have a good materiality assessment first to ensure that you are working on the most important thing to your stakeholders. So materiality assessments can be conducted every few years or when there's a significant change or new external issues, and this keeps them relevant for those ESG strategies to build on.
So carrying out some of those fundamentals will definitely put you in a good position for when you are starting to answer some of these sustainability questionnaires. But what actions can you take beyond just those basics? So we're going to look at the accelerators now that will really extend the scope of what a business is taking into account and ensure that actions are taking after just that initial measurement baselining stage. So we mentioned Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions, obviously those from your supply chain, are on average 11.4 times larger than direct emissions from operations. So they are really important to measure as a next step to just those Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And many sustainability questionnaires and assessments will ask you whether or not you've measured your Scope 3 emissions. And when it comes to setting science-based targets, for example, you must measure and in most instances commit to reducing your Scope 3 emissions. We know it can be quite a daunting task. There are 15 different categories of Scope 3 emissions, but in terms of tips for where to start, definitely map your value chain as a starting point to understand what your activities are, what you're buying and selling, who your suppliers are. You could start with categories where you have more readily available data as well, and use screening methods, so that sort of spend-based data to estimate emissions across all the categories, and identifying key hotspots and suppliers as well in terms of where to focus your data collection and reduction efforts, just to understand where you can make the most impact. So something else which often will come up in a supplier questionnaire is whether or not you have set an emissions reduction target, and again often whether or not this target is aligned with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So once you have calculated that baseline, setting a target is a really good next step to help you excel further. There's three main types of target that come up most often and which the Science-Based Targets Initiative refer to, and there's pros and cons to each type of target, and companies really should consider carefully which one might be best for you given your sector and your product and what your growth is as well. So there's absolute targets. So this means that companies are reducing emissions at the same rate. Your business essentially needs to decouple emissions from growth. They're relatively simple to set and are widely respected as demonstrating strong ambition, but they can be quite challenging to achieve for growing organisations, and reductions could be due to reduced output, for example, rather than savings. So it's hard to compare with peers on that as well. There is intensity targets too, so a reduction in emissions intensity per unit output. So for example, a reduction in emissions per tonne of steel produced. The benefit of these is that they recognise increased efficiency in businesses that are growing, and intensity targets but they don't always result in absolute emissions reduction if production volumes increase. So, for example, if you're producing steel, which has less carbon per tonne to produce, but you've produced lots more of that steel. So they can therefore be seen as less robust or credible. And it can also be difficult to set an intensity target for companies which have quite a diverse product range. The final one is engagement. So organisations must commit to engaging suppliers to align their decarbonisation with science-based target pathways, for example. And those targets allow organisations to act even if they don't have really good Scope 3 data. So this is what we're seeing a lot recently in terms of customers and companies setting science-based targets and then putting pressure on their suppliers to also set science-based targets. So science-based targets won't be for everyone, and there are actually quite a lot of other options out there, and some are of which are free to commit to. If you want to get your science-based target validated, there is quite a fee associated with that. But you can set your own targets, and they could still be aligned with Science-Based Targets Initiative, but not validated. There are some alternatives out there as well. So the UN Race to Zero, for example, the SME Climate Hub, the B Corp Climate Collective, and Business Declares as well. I won't go through these now, but we'll send out the slides afterwards so you can have a look at those as options. So another accelerator is having a carbon reduction plan in place, and that's actually one of the requirements of the PPN 0621 notice that the government require. You may be being asked by your customers whether you have one of these in place. So once you've established a baseline and set a target, the carbon reduction plan essentially sets out your pathway of how to reduce emissions to reach that target. So some of the actions suggested as part of the energy use fundamental that Liz was talking about can support with establishing one of these, and specifically having a carbon and energy audit conducted to understand what actions can be taken and the energy or carbon savings that will result in. So there's an example here from Unipart, who produced a carbon reduction plan as part of the government requirement obligation. And essentially the initiatives and their associated carbon reduction are mapped out on a timeline of when they will be implemented. So it's a really clear pathway towards getting to net zero. So as we've mentioned, sustainability questionnaires can often request information on a whole range of ESG issues. It's not always just the carbon sort of net zero target element, which you may not have the information to respond to or have even considered before. So accelerating in this area can be done by conducting a SWOT analysis against various ESG factors. So we'd usually suggest doing that in person in an interactive workshop style format, getting a range of employees from different departments and different levels involved in that as well, so you can really map out across the range of employees what their opinions are and where the gaps might be. And it's a really beneficial exercise for understanding your company's current position, as well as managing risks and leveraging those opportunities and engaging the employees within it as well, and also improving efficiencies and decision making.
Okay, so after you've implemented the fundamentals and the accelerators, you may want to excel further and become leaders in your area or within your supply chain. So the overarching approach to capture all aspects would be a comprehensive environmental, social and governance strategy. So environmental, social and governance criteria are used by a framework by lots of organisations to evaluate their success beyond profit, manage risks and capture opportunities. So the key objectives of ESG go beyond making short-term profit, aiming to create positive social and environmental outcomes, long-term sustainability and making the world, people and planet better. So thinking back into the carbon tunnel vision concept we mentioned towards the beginning, it's really important that organisations are considering a broader approach. And even when it comes to emissions, efforts are often focused on things like energy efficiency and renewable energy. Actually, this only addresses 55% of our emissions which are associated with energy use, while the remaining 45% comes from producing the things that we consume, so products such as cars, clothes, food, and other things we buy and use every day. So it really is appropriate to think beyond just your energy use and your site level emissions. So given the significant impact of emissions from products, leading companies often investigate this as a next step after calculating their organisational footprint. So you can measure the full environmental footprint of a product through something called a life cycle assessment. So this is commonly abbreviated to an LCA or an LCIA for a life cycle impact assessment. An LCA effectively measures the impact a product or service has had on the world around it. So you measure this impact through a range of environmental indicators. So typically that would include things like human toxicity, global warming potential, which is essentially a carbon footprint, ecotoxicity, acidification, and eutrophication. So the full environmental impact of that product, including kind of raw material depletion, as well as just its carbon impact. So in contrast, a product carbon footprint, or a PCF for short, is a measurement of the total greenhouse gas emissions generated by a product or service, therefore measuring the embodied carbon. It's sometimes referred to within the item or that service. So it's worth noting that this measurement is often included with a full life cycle assessment. So product carbon footprints are typically measured through the global warming potential, which is reported as the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So this doesn't mean it only measures carbon dioxide, but the figure consolidates all 7 Kyoto Protocol greenhouse gases into one indicator. So an example might be you could have a product carbon footprint for the emissions associated with making a mug or a laptop. So you can measure the product carbon footprint across the full life cycle of a product or service, and this might be right the way from resource extraction of the materials used or the ingredients, the production or manufacturing and assembly of products, distribution across various stages, so resources to factory, factory to customer, and customer to waste, the consumption or use of that product, and then when the product reaches its end of life, what it takes to recover, recycle, incinerate, or landfill that product. And this full life cycle assessment, as shown on the screen, is known as cradle to grave, so beginning to end. You can also measure product footprint just from the resource extraction and production phases of the life cycle, and this is known as cradle to gate, as shown on the screen now. And so that means measuring the environmental impact of getting the product to the factory gate and ready for onward transport. So there's lots of benefits of completing a product footprint, and they can enhance the quantity of data you have relating to your products and help inform high-level strategic business decisions. So given that you've got that data about each level of or each stage of that product life cycle. You can also conduct a hotspot analysis, so you could identify processes and materials that have the largest impact environmentally, and this will support you to make decisions and research and develop ideas to improve your product and lower that impact. It can also help you to substantiate any green claims you're making on the sustainability of your product, by providing in-depth and comprehensive results to share with your customer, supply chain, or key stakeholders. And they can support in the comparison between products, so giving you a bit of a competitive advantage to compare against your competitors, which is increasingly important as we move into people making purchasing decisions based on environmental credentials. It is also becoming more and more common for supply chain stakeholders to request product level information, and completing a product footprint can really help with this. So often the pressure here we see comes from larger retailers or corporations that have significant environmental targets or goals with Scope 3 calculations and baselining. So as we've talked about, Scope 3 emissions is something that Science Based Targets initiative setting companies need to look at. So they need to look at everything they purchase and the emissions associated with that. And the most accurate way of doing that is having a product carbon footprint for each item that they purchase. So we're seeing increased pressure for this throughout the supply chain. And that can be really important in terms of winning tenders, and we're increasingly seeing procurement decisions being made based on life cycle assessments and product carbon footprints. And finally, product carbon footprints can help increase the accuracy of your own Scope 3 calculations and your goal setting. So we know that Scope 3 often accounts for more than 70% of an organisation's carbon. So if you have a product footprint for everything that you buy, that can really help you understand your emissions. Okay, so moving back away from carbon to the wider ESG agenda, there's always going to be various ways to assess your ESG performance and demonstrate your commitment on ESG. But having a holistic ESG roadmap in place, producing an annual ESG report is a really key part of the journey, and it will help to set you apart from your competitors in these kind of surveys. So companies should be tracking and measuring their impact throughout the year in relation to ESG issues, particularly those which you've identified as material in your materiality assessment that we discussed in the foundation stage. So this should involve tracking metrics such as carbon emissions, waste generated, volunteering hours, distribution of employees by age, gender or ethnicity, and customer satisfaction scores. Tracking and reporting on these key metrics will put you in a better position when you're completing the sustainability questionnaires. The majority of the information that you'll need within these questionnaires is probably already going to be found within your ESG report, so often you can upload these as supporting evidence as well. And ESG reports give companies the opportunity to disclose their impact, enhancing transparency and helping to build trust amongst your stakeholders. That might include investors, employees and customers. And it can also help to strengthen your reputation and credibility.
Okay, so we're going to just tie it off with some top tips to bear in mind for completing the most sort of common sustainability questionnaires and assessments. So alongside the standard disclosure for the Carbon Disclosure Project, you'll often be asked to disclose if you have identified any risks and opportunities and explain the potential financial consequence of those. So it's probably worth doing that SWOT exercise that I mentioned earlier, which will really help with this section of the CDP, just to identify what those risks and opportunities and the sort of materiality financial side as well, that those will have. And you'll also be asked to demonstrate your understanding of stakeholders within the value chain. So again, as we mentioned earlier, mapping your value chain, understanding who your stakeholders are ahead of making the submission will put you in a really good position for when you come to do that. On the EcoVadis side, they can be quite picky in terms of the documents that they accept as evidence. So if you're going to do an EcoVadis assessment and upload documents as evidence, just make sure that they have your company name and a date on it. The EcoVadis require this to show that it's relevant to your entity and up to date. So just make sure that any documents that you have in place ahead of the submission or that you are going to be submitting have those on there. And then for science-based targets, it's just important to remember that there are that sort of range of target options available. There's separate routes for SMEs as well, which we didn't touch upon, but the criteria for those are all on the website. And there's different criteria that apply for the near and the long-term targets as well. So just make sure that you are fully reading up on all of the options, what the criteria is, what's involved in that, and what it might mean for your business before you commit. So it's important just to read up on all the guidance available. So just going on to how we can help you with all of this, we're essentially here to support you with every stage of your sustainability journey. Over the last 8 years of offering sustainability consultancy, we've really grown in line with customer needs and expanding a range of comprehensive services to support their success as well. So we've sort of increased the services we're offering in line with that increasing demand from suppliers from these sustainability questionnaires that we're seeing come up more and more. We do have a skilled team of consultants as well, with specialisms ranging from resource efficiency and the circular economy through to carbon measurement, energy and environmental, social and governance. So we've listed the various services on the screen there that we can support you with, from the fundamentals, accelerators and leading section that we've spoken about. But if you would like to learn any more about any of these services and the support we can offer you, please do get in touch. So we're going to leave up just a customer testimonial there and give you a few minutes just to ask any questions. So in the panel that you should have at the top or side of your screen there is a question section there. So we're going to give you a few minutes in case anyone has a question, and then we will look to answer those.
Okay, thank you. So we've got quite a lot of housekeeping questions around the slides and whether they'll be sent out, as there's quite a lot of information on the slides. Absolutely, we'll send this to everybody who's attended today. Also, I think the webinar is being recorded, so you should be able to see them back as well. We did also have a question around the CDP and where you can find out more information on the CDP. So the Carbon Disclosure Project do have a really good website themselves, which has an awful lot of information and guidance. There's been quite a lot of changes with the Carbon Disclosure Project this year, which is why they've actually extended the deadline. So usually organisations would have to report by the end of July. And this year they have pushed that back to September to allow people more time to find out more information.
Thanks, Liz. We've also had a question come in about an ISO, if there's an ISO standard coming through for ESG. ESG is such a broad sort of area. I think it'd be quite difficult for the ISO standards to release one purely about that. There are quite a lot of ESG related standards out there. So there's sort of the Global Reporting Initiative, which is the most widely used reporting standard for ESG. A lot of the larger companies use that. We're also seeing a lot of sort of incoming regulations. So in the EU, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is coming in, sort of asking questions around the environment, climate change, as well as those social and governance issues. So we're seeing quite a lot upcoming in the field of ESG. And there's a few other standards out there for sort of social responsibility. There is an ISO one around just that. But in terms of the wider ESG, not just a simple ISO one is coming.
So the next question is around if there's any training courses in carbon management and reporting. So we are operating a training course in October on net zero. So that is a half-day virtual online course, and I think the pricing for that is around £250 per delegate. So there's that option. We do also do ourselves bespoke training for businesses if you want to learn how to calculate a carbon footprint yourselves. So we would go through the training with you, and there's like a worked example exercise. So that's kind of on an inquiry-led basis, and that would be for one organisation at once. Or we do have the open course option in October.
Thanks, Liz. So there's another question here. Does the UK have an agreed common method of calculating carbon footprint that suppliers should refer to? So the UK government do publish emissions conversion factors every year. So they're updated each year, and they have those for a whole range of Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 activities. So those emissions factors do tend to be used for the UK. In terms of a standard, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard is the main one that's sort of internationally recognised as the standard to report against. And there's a range of different emissions factors as well for spend base, for example, so the SIC codes and various other emissions factors out there. But in terms of the UK, definitely those government conversion factors are the most widely used and widely recognised.
Okay, we've got one here as well around carbon neutrality and whether being carbon neutral is the answer. I can buy offsets to offset my carbon. Will this help with my scores? So offsetting is obviously something that's been around for a long time now. In terms of your scores on supplier sustainability questionnaires, offsetting is unlikely to impact your score greatly. So something else that's worth noting with the Science Based Targets initiative, which is what's driving a lot of these sort of supply chain carbon reductions, is that businesses can't use offsets towards those reductions. Offsets can be used, but they need to be used sort of responsibly, in line with also making reductions of your emissions as well. And a lot of businesses do still look to have a carbon neutral supply chain, or to reduce that within the supply chain. But increasingly, people are also checking that you are making reductions before you do those offsets.
So we've had another question in asking for resources or pointers for carrying out a materiality assessment. So as I mentioned, this is one of the services that we do offer. We've supported a number of companies with carrying these out, and we've done one for ourselves. But I'd just say it's important to map out a whole range of factors, understand which ones are most relevant to your business, and then ask as many sort of different stakeholder groups as you can to get all the opinions, and account for that double materiality aspect, so that you're understanding both the impact on environment and society, as well as that financial impact. But as I mentioned, we do offer that as a service, so if you wanted support with that, do get in touch.
We've also had a question around different ratings indicators. So we mentioned EcoVadis, but somebody's mentioned here as well SEDEX. So I'm aware that SEDEX are expanding their social, environmental and governance sort of audits and surveying. The mention of EcoVadis is purely because this is the one that we see the most in our customers being asked to respond to EcoVadis. So yeah, there's definitely other platforms and other organisations. They all tend to have very similar questions and very similar key themes, as we've mentioned today, in terms of asking on scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then moving on to scope 3 and wider ESG is definitely a forward trend.
Great. So we've had another one. Is there anyone who publishes industry standard carbon footprints so we can measure ourselves against like for like? So we do get this question quite a lot from customers, asking how they can compare their footprint or how they're doing against other people. And it is really difficult because there's not one publicly available database that everyone reports against. There's the streamlined energy and carbon reporting regulations, in which businesses have to publish their emissions within their company's house accounts, but that only covers scope 1 and 2 and part of scope 3. Carbon reduction plans for the government, they have to be publicly available on websites. The CDP disclosures, so I think they've got a database where everyone sort of publishes their scores, and you can choose sort of what things to make available. And there's various other things like that, but I'd recommend, if you want to compare against a competitor specifically or someone in your industry, maybe have a look at their website, see if they've published their own report, and that's sort of a way you can tell. But unfortunately, there's not a widely available database at the moment across all sectors.
Okay, we've got loads of questions today, so you're keeping us on our toes for a Monday morning. It's good that you're all listening and participating, so thank you. We've got another one about making climate investments or purchasing carbon credits. So yeah, I'd really recommend understanding, are they verified, doing as much due diligence and research as you possibly can on any offsets that you're looking to purchase, considering number of factors, including but not only cost. So it might be that you might choose to offset within the UK and not actually purchase as many offsets, but purchase more potentially high quality offsets or local offsets that have other benefits. And so you wouldn't be carbon neutral in terms of balancing your footprint, but actually the offsets that you have purchased, you have really good confidence in. And so it is really about doing that due diligence with offsets. And we're always really keen to stress as a business that it's all about trying to make those reductions. So if you're going to invest money in anything, invest it in your own site, in things like solar panels or in energy efficiency improvements and upgrading equipment and compressors and things like that, which will have an impact on your bottom line in terms of cost savings, but will also reduce the environmental impact. And then offsets is kind of like a nice to have to complete the picture, and a tool to communicate to customers, but always start with that reduction part first.
So next question, are Scope 3 conversion factors for carbon calculations credible? It is quite a tricky one. Obviously, Scope 3 data is really difficult to collect, especially primary data, when you're trying to get that from down the supply chain. And often businesses will have to use those spend-based emissions factors as a sort of proxy or estimation, but it is accepted as a screening method as a tool. So I know the Science Based Targets Initiative do accept screening-based spend-based methods as a sort of Scope 3 calculation. I think they'll only increase in accuracy. Again, the UK government conversion factors are probably quite low quality at the moment for Scope 3, but will hopefully increase over the coming years. But yeah, it's just a case of trying to engage with your suppliers and get as much primary data as you can in order to use the more credible Scope 3 conversion factors for activity data or for sort of mass-based data rather than that spend-based data.
Okay, so I think we're coming to the end of the questions now. If you do have any more questions, mine and Susanna's details are on one of the initial slides, and feel free to get in touch with somebody at Beyondly through one of the email addresses here, or just simply sustainability@beyond.ly, and we'll look to get back with you. But hopefully you found that informative and helpful, and it's given you some ideas of ways to get moving on your journey. So I hope you enjoy the rest of Net Zero Week and have a lovely Monday. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.